as the students asked me the questions, I realized that one of the things I was fortunate with, even as young, is that I accept what happens, whether it's positive or negative. Because if you reject it, if you fight against it, if you repress it, then you can't get over it.
That is Leslie Mezei, Holocaust survivor and author of Tapestry of Survival. Leslie joins us this week on the Speakeasy podcast to discuss the continued importance of International Holocaust Remembrance Day, spirituality, and interfaith dialogue during our times. Most importantly, Leslie speaks about life lessons he's learned throughout his journey that we can apply to our lives today. If you haven't already, please like, subscribe, and follow us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you find yourselves listening. Thanks again. From the perspective of 2021, International Holocaust Remembrance Day has just passed about a week ago. And with your perspectives of being a survivor, with your perspective of emigrating to Canada, through the perspective of current events that are going on in the background, what is the importance of Holocaust Remembrance Day to you?
So Holocaust Remembrance Day has become much more important to me than it was a few years ago, before I published the story of my family's Holocaust, A Tapestry of Survival, which was published by the Israeli Foundation, which makes it available to students all over the place. And so that was published 2 years ago now. And since then, I've given a lot of talks, especially to school groups, and I've become a lot more aware of the importance of telling this story. And I'm happy to say there is an increased interest. There's a lot of interest in hearing about it. So as I was beginning to talk, I realized it wasn't enough just to remember what happened and tell that story, but to talk about the lessons learned from it. The Israeli Foundation has a wonderful 3-part motto: know the past, heal the present, and enhance the future. And so that's how I structure my talks. Mm-hmm. So as I talk to students, I talk about the importance of being aware that there's increased anti-Semitism again, that there is other forms of bigotry and racism, and that they need to anytime they hear anything like that, they need to speak up, as I did ever since I was a young man. And the comparisons that are being made these days between the white supremacist movement in the United States, yes, with the storming of the Capitol Hill on January 6th, some of them wearing anti-Semitic slogans.
Right.
And then I heard more discussion about how the white supremacist bigots have taken up some of the conspiracy theories that anti-Semitism had for a long time. And so the importance of people, especially young people, hearing about what actually happened, how terrible it was, and how it's not impossible for it to happen again if we are not really careful. And because of the spiritual journey I've been on since the death of my first wife, Annie, who was also a Holocaust survivor, and the spiritual journey I've gone on, I end up talking about the importance of the unity in diversity, that we can work towards how we are all one human family, how on a spiritual level there is something that goes through all of us. Right. So I'm really now involved on an almost full-time basis with this message of the Holocaust and of how we can make it a better world.
Right. Now, how long did it take you to arrive at that view? Because I feel for someone who's been through such tragedy, who's overcome such difficulties, personal and just throughout your entire life, how do you have that wisdom and that patience and that understanding to be able to say, you know what, I have to be able to grow and learn from these terrible situations sometimes?
Well, actually, it took me midlife before I really began into that.
Mm-hmm.
As I mentioned, when after I came to Canada, I married. We had 2 children. I was an upward striving young man. I got into computers first with Ontario Hydro and Confederational Life, and then at the University of Toronto, I was teaching computer science and computer graphics. And then my wife, Annie, developed a brain tumor, and she died in 1977 at the age of 45. And it was then that I really began the grief process only then. When I was younger, I was not in the camps, but one of my sisters was, and a brother was in forced labor, and my father was taken away and killed in Auschwitz. But I didn't really do the grief work till I was doing it for Annie. And that's when I started on a spiritual journey, became much more self-aware, and did reading in psychology and theology and mysticism and so on. And then more recently, in the last decade or two, I also got more involved in what is needed in the world, environmentally sustainable, socially just, spiritually fulfilling. We used to do a workshop for the Patchwork Alliance that said that.
And how would you evaluate currently in society? How do you think we're doing a job collectively in terms of being environmentally responsible, in terms of being spiritually and emotionally respectful? Are we doing a good job? Are we trending in the right direction? Or are we going in the wrong direction?
Well, that will take a moment to answer, because when I was at the university in the 1960s and 70s, which I left after Anna died, it was a utopian age. We thought that we were really going to fix the problems of the world. The Secretary General of the United Nations said, it isn't our resources that determine what decisions we can make. It's our decisions that determines what resources we can have. And we really believed that we were on the way to do that. And then began financial crisis. Then began what I call the Thatcher-Reagan reactionary times. And we're still in some ways in it. And so we move forward. There are huge numbers of small organizations that want to make this a better world. And these workshops that we used to run for the Patchwork Alliance, which we called Awakening the Dreamer, Changing the Dream. The dream of us about prosperity has happened, but we need a lot more than that. Mm-hmm. And so, especially with the Trumpian terrible 4 years, it is a lot of people have become more pessimistic. I used to call myself an optimist, expect that things will be well. But now I've been following the idea of active hope. Joanna Mezei has a book and has a whole movement towards active hope. We need to concentrate on what we are hoping for, whether we're going to achieve it or not, and work towards that. So I think we now have to dig ourselves out of this sort of pessimism that too many people have. But I know a lot of people who haven't been in that and who have been progressive, whether they're from the religions, the spirituality, the environment. We have a wonderfully speaking liberal government in Canada, but it's not making enough changes, whether it's on the environment, whether it's on the indigenous people, whether it's on any of these things. And so I'm hopeful that Joe Biden in the U.S. will help pull us along towards and that he's going to be able to make more of a difference.
Right. And so, and this, it's funny, you sort of are brimming with hope. I can feel it when you're speaking that you are very hopeful and optimistic,
Yes.
despite some of the things which you feel are very concerning.
Yes.
And I'm curious how your earlier experiences, I know during the Holocaust, you mentioned in your excerpts that you had actually been housed by Raoul Wallenberg. And I was curious how that experience maybe shaped your view of optimism, of maybe other people in humanity, of being able to see the brighter side of things, and if that played a role at all.
Well, it's hard to know because I'm not even certain whether we were in one of Raoul Wallenberg's houses. I certainly haven't met him.
Mhm.
But the open ghetto of Budapest in 1944, when I was 13 years old, and it's interesting, just last week I was speaking to 13-year-old students here, and they actually read my book, and so they were asking questions. So indeed, Wallenberg did a lot in saving some of us and some other of the houses. So the ghetto was actually apartment houses, and some of those apartment houses were sponsored by the Swedes through Raoul Wallenberg, and but also by the Vatican and Switzerland. And so I think I started out as being somewhat of a happy-go-lucky boy and finding that life is an adventure. I was not in the camps myself, although we were in the ghetto, and I had a number of close encounters that could have killed me. But I saw life as an adventure, and I always found some beauty. So it is hard to tell the effect that had. I think the biggest effect now that I've become more self-reflective and so on, is that I see issues more as life and death. I like to say that I want to hope for the best, but be prepared for the worst.
Right. And where did that feeling, where did that insight come from? Is that just sort of life experience that it came from being more pragmatic and sort of ideally looking for the best, but still expecting the worst? Or is that just something that sort of has grown throughout your whole life?
Well, maybe it's a little bit of each. I was one of 5 children, and I was the last one. And maybe I was a little more pampered than the others, although we were very poor in Hungary. And so I think partly how I started, and partly ever since Anna's death and my being involved in spirituality, in a universal form of spirituality, a universal form of Sufism. And I think that I'm just fortunate in that way, but also it has been growing as I went along.
Right. And it's funny because I'm trying to hypothesize what you would say about your message of unity and of cooperation when it comes to the Jewish community, because I feel that the Jewish community, especially in the United States, when you look at it, is a rather fractured community based upon religious denomination, based upon politics. And I'm curious, do you have a specific message, or do you have specific thoughts when it comes to not only more broadly healing society, but also internally healing the Jewish community?
Well, I haven't given thought to that, I have to admit, because although I continue to be a Jew, I have a lot of respect for all faith, and I was actually an interfaith minister. We do a universal worship service where we light candles to each of the religions and read from their books, including the Jewish, of course. But I've never converted from Judaism. So I am a Jew, and like many other Jews, I'm not practicing it. So it's more than just the religion. It's an ethnic group. It's certainly not a race, as Hitler wanted to tell us. it is absolutely amazing when you look at history, how as Jews we survived as Jews all these at least 2,000-3,000 years. That is really amazing. And at the same time, it's sad to see how as the group that always looked different and prayed different, that anti-Semitism was so strong all that time. In the 13th or 14th century, when the first big pandemic came, they blamed it on the Jews. So, on the other hand, many Jews have made great contributions, and many Hungarian Jews particularly. But it is a difficult thing to say, and I think we just have to look back our heritage. I think I'm of the more progressive or liberal ilk, shall we say. Within each religion, within each group, there's a whole range of people, and yet I have relatives in Israel. I had two sisters. One of them was not religious at all, and neither are her descendants, and the other one became Orthodox, and her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren are Orthodox, and some of them are settlers, but we still communicate with each other. So it is hard to say. It's not that different from what we really have to say to the whole world. We have to become more aware of our humanity and of our community. And one of the things we say about the world is there has to be more local action, there has to be more community understanding. And as long as we can live with the people beside us.
Right. And I think that message dovetails very well with your work with interfaith communities and just the whole interfaith initiative. I believe sometime in the 1970s, 1980s, you sort of began to explore that area a little more. Can you tell us a little bit more about how you found your way into the interfaith dialogue and what you learned from it?
Well, while I was still at the university, I discovered future studies. And we actually had a group at the new college called the Club of New, where we met every Wednesday noon. Marshall McLuhan was one of the people. Gregory Baum, the brilliant Catholic writer who originally was Jewish, and a lot of other people. So I've always been interested in looking to the future and looking at hopeful organizations. I was a member of, we used to have a Canadian United Nations organization. We had a global citizenship where you could get a passport as a global citizen. But then it's more in the 1990s, I got involved with the interfaith work. And organizations like the Scarborough Mission, which is a Catholic mission here in Toronto, we just closed its doors, but has done a lot of the interfaith work. And we used to do panels of people from the different religions talking together, even worship services where we had different spiritualities of the different part. I became a communicator. I published a newsletter for about 12 years, and then I did a directory of the interfaith organizations and of the history. And from that, I went on to what I call interspirituality, which is another movement where interfaith is between people who are of specific faith. But there are a lot of people who say they're spiritual but not religious. We now call them spiritually independent. And so this interspirituality leads to that. And then there is pluralism, which the Aga Khan sponsored a global center for pluralism in Ottawa because he said that Canada is more pluralistic than anywhere else. Pluralism has to do with accepting differences, working for diversity. So I was fortunate to get involved with all of this.
And would you say from an early age, you were always predisposed to be more spiritual, more self-reflective? Is that something that was inherent and innate in you, or is that, again, something that you had acquired throughout your years?
I suspect that's inherent in all of us, but many of us don't have it. In actual fact, both my first wife, Annie, and I felt that we have not learned the goodies of our religion. Our parents were Jewish, but were not religious, didn't keep holidays, but then we suffered all the baddies. And so we didn't follow it. We didn't follow any other religion either. So actually, not until her death and my sort of spiritual awakening did I come to this.
And it's interesting because at that moment in your excerpt, and I'll have to post its hyperlink in the show notes afterwards, but that moment seems to be sort of a before and after separation for you. I think before that event and after that event, you were fundamentally a different individual in how you looked at religion, spirituality, humanity, forgiveness, all these kinds of very large concepts, I think, dramatically changed in your worldview.
Well, people talk about a conversion experience. It was a real conversion experience. I was, like Jews do, arguing with God, whom I didn't really think I believed in. And then, just as Anna was dying, I had this experience of suddenly submitting and saying, I will accept whatever happens. I won't go into detail now, but yes, it was. And her death was like a total shattering. We had the kind of marriage where you did everything together and it was like being one. These days, more couples are practice more an interdependence, but not such a dependence. So it was like a shattering experience, but I was fortunate, as most people do, is a new start.
And you said particularly that your ability to forgive changed dramatically after that event. What was it? I remember in your article, you were talking about how you visited some of the former concentration camps in Poland, and you sort of had this tranquility, this ability to come to terms with everything that happened to your family that you had experienced. Can you walk us through your mindset and what was going through your head at that time?
So we're now into 1999, where I would be 68 years old. And I finally got to Auschwitz, and I went on a tour where this English-speaking guide took us everywhere. Nobody said a word. And we finally got from Auschwitz to the larger later camp called Birkenau, which is where the Hungarians, like my father, was taken directly on the trains to the gas chambers. I must tell you that it started late in Hungary. The Germans took over Hungary in March of 1944. As I said, I was 13. And it was the most efficient deportation. 450,000 people deported and killed in 2 months. Terrible. And in any case, when we got to Birkenau, and I've been always thinking about what it must have been like for him, and I wanted to touch his spirit and let it go, and I did. And then I wanted to touch the spirit of the other victims and let them go, and I did. And something made me also want to touch the spirit of the victimizers and let them go and forgive them. And I had a lot of, afterwards, I had a lot of thinking about that. There's a book by Simon Wiesenthal about forgiveness where he asks a whole lot of people of different religions whether they could forgive or not. But for me, forgiveness became very important. And I'd like to read you a very short quote by Rabbi Harold Kushner that explains what happened to me wasn't in the head, it was in the heart. Forgiving happens inside us. It represents a letting go of the sense of grievance, and perhaps most importantly, a letting go of the role of victim.
The second segment is just around the corner, but while we have you here, we wanted to say how grateful we've been over the past couple of weeks for all the support you've shown us. We're happy to announce that we've logged over 5,000 page views and 2,000 individual sessions. If you enjoy the content and message we're putting out, please consider donating to us either through PayPal for single-time donations or Patreon for monthly contributions. They can be found on our homepage under the donation tab. They really do make a difference helping support our writers and keeping this whole show running. Coming up next is the second and final segment of our amazing chat with Leslie. Thank you again for all your support.
Okay, but first let me come back to what I was going to say, which is that even though I was doing so well, once every few years, I'd get this anxiety attack, especially when things were going particularly well. And I would start feeling, who am I to do so well? I, the little boy from Gödelö, my hometown, when we were told we didn't have a right to live. And this would happen once every few years. But since 1999, that forgiveness experience, it has not come back. And so as I was getting older, and I will be 90 this coming July, I've had 3 operations in the last 10 years, and I entered them with a form of equanimity that I was hoping I've got longer to live and more that I can do, but I was willing to accept whatever will come. That's, I guess, part of this spiritual journey. Mm-hmm. But the COVID experience actually has been the opposite of what it was for a lot of people, because as I was getting older, I was able to go to fewer events. And so what happened with COVID, which is now almost a year, is that while physically isolated, and we're in a nice modern house with central air conditioning and heating, and so Kathy and I are happy with that, I'm actually more socially connected through Zoom, as we're talking now, with different groups. I have a music teacher. I play a ney, a bamboo flute, on which I've got a teacher in London, England, who is teaching me certain musics with it, and discussion groups. So for me, it's worked well, and I think there will be some parts of what happened during this pandemic that is going to help others too.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I take away just from speaking with you. I feel a spiritual resilience. I feel that whatever obstacles might look like they're in your way, somehow you do some martial arts, some judo, and you make them into your friend in a way, and you grow from them and you learn from them. And I think that is something which is so important for a lot of people I know are very much struggling with the time that we're in right now. They're going stir crazy, and there's depression and anxiety rates are very high. And so it's amazing that the perspective and insight you have today, which you gained from an earlier time, is still so relevant to people today.
Thank you. Yes. As the students ask me the questions, I realized that one of the things I was fortunate with, even as young, is that I accept what happens, whether it's positive or negative. Because if you reject it, if you fight against it, if you repress it, then you can't get over it. So just accept what is happening, and then do as much as possible to have a good outcome for yourself and for others. And another thing that I learned along with the spirituality in those times is the importance to be of service, to help others.
Mm-hmm. That's amazing. I think that's a great place to end it. I would love to send this copy to you after I edit and everything, but I thought it was a great chat. And I think it's just a message that I think a lot of people will really resonate with. And I'd love to have you back on whenever your schedule maybe will suit you, because I think it's just, for me, it's very spiritually cleansing. I feel much better after I speak with you. And I think it's a great message that people always want to listen to.
Thank you. And if you're interested in the Holocaust, you could read my book. It's available in Kindle version too.
Thank you again for listening to the Speakeasy podcast. I had an amazing time chatting with Leslie, and we hope that he'll continue to join us from time to time to pass along some more sage advice. You can purchase a copy of his book, Tapestry of Survival, below in the show notes. This is the first episode in our International Holocaust Remembrance commemoration. Stay tuned for our upcoming chat with Holocaust survivor Pinchas Guder sometime next week. Again, if you haven't already, please like, subscribe, and follow us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you find yourselves listening. Thanks again.